Good morning, everyone. I'm David Chalmers, and I'm the chair of Sunrise Diversity, the local charity in North Devon here, which celebrates diversity, challenges discrimination, and aims to change attitudes. And this morning, I am delighted to be joined for LGBT History Month with Lord Jonny Oates, who's the Liberal Democrat spokesperson on the environment and climate emergency in the House of Lords. We have been, as many of you may be aware, this is a regular event that we put on each February for LGBT History Month, and we've had smart speakers, and I'm sure that today will be as insightful and exciting as previous years. And one of the really interesting things is that Jonny, can I call you Jonny? Yes?
Of course you can.
Yeah. Jonny has brought out a book which is called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, which I think we'll be sort of referring to through the course of this morning. It will be recorded. I think recording has already started, and after we've sort of spoken a little bit together, there'll be the opportunities for those of you that are taking part, and this morning that is staff and students from Petrock College, that you can ask questions and answers later on, but it's probably after the first bit. But if you want to ask any questions, I would also ask if you could put them into the chat facility, and then we can have a look at them. But I'll come back to them. That doesn't mean that later on that you wouldn't be able to ask other questions if you want to. All right. Well, look. Good morning, Jonny. It's really, really great to be here, or rather, see you here. We're getting sort of used to these sort of remote events these days. Sort of, we're all in different places. I mean, here in Northern Devon, spring seems to have arrived. It's a really beautiful sunny day. So just the sort of...
I'm afraid I can't say the same in London, where it's a fairly dreary and wet day. But there we go. I'm glad spring has arrived in North Devon.
Yeah, it really has. Long last. It sort of feels like it here. And the reading, I read your book over the weekend, and I was really sort of, such a great sort of story about yourself. And about your sort of, career and issues, and we'll come on to those. But I just really wanted to start off with right at the very beginning, because there's that sort of, you as a young man that took off to, Ethiopia. And I was there myself at the beginning of last year for a month. And that sort of fascinated me that perhaps you sort of just give us a little bit of a taste of the book, of how that came about.
Yeah, sure. Well, back in 1984, there was a very famous BBC news broadcast from northern Ethiopia, from Tigray province, a place called Karem. And it highlighted what Michael Burke, who was the person who did the report, what he described as a biblical famine now in the 20th century. And he referred to the place where 40,000 starving people had gathered to try and find food as the closest thing to hell on earth. I saw that broadcast when I was 14 at the time, nearly 15. And it was showcased. It was the number one news item on the six o'clock news bulletin. That was pretty extraordinary, and I don't think it would happen now, actually. But it just struck a real chord with me, that amidst the comparative plenty that we had in the West, or the global North, as we might describe it now, and yet there were people starving in the world. And I thought, we've got to do something about it. And I wasn't alone. I mean, it's the broadcast that inspired Bob Geldof to launch Band Aid, and that subsequently became Live Aid, which some people may have heard about, but it raised a huge amount of money. And I kind of thought, well, all these adults are screwing up the world. They're sat there doing nothing. So I kind of thought, well, I better do something. And I hatched this rather mad plan, which would have just probably remained a fantasy, which was that I was going to run away to Ethiopia and help out. I hadn't worked out how, but I thought I would just help. And as I say, it probably would have remained a fantasy, but then one morning I was in my dad's study, and he had left a new American Express card unsigned on his desk, and he had the same name as me. I kind of saw it as a sign, and I just picked it up. I signed it. I picked up my passport, and I got a bus to Regent Street and found the Ethiopian Airlines office, and I booked a ticket. So that was really the start of a fairly mad adventure, my first attempt to kind of change the world.
No, it really was. And one of the things when I was reading it, was at that young age, I mean, obviously you were aware of your sexuality. And how much did that sort of, there's a very impacts on your own sort of mental health. I know this has been an issue. Mental health is something you've been a real campaigner about through your political career. But at that moment, at the beginning of the book, to me, it's very, very poignant of how that is impacting on you.
Absolutely. I mean, I was, as you say, I was struggling to come to terms with my sexuality. That time, 1984, 85, was a very particular a time to be dealing with that, because it was in the midst of the AIDS crisis, and there was anti-gay hysteria, which was being driven by the tabloid press, and it was a pretty nasty time to be kind of working yourself out. I'd suffered quite severely from mental health problems. I think lots of people, regardless of their sexuality, have to deal with mental health problems, particularly in their adolescence. But it was given a particular harsh focus by what was going on at the time. It wasn't a particularly nice place to grow up as a gay teenager. I think all of those things were percolating around my head, and I was a pretty messed up kid, I guess. I mean, I don't think a sane, rational person would have stolen their dad's credit card and ran away from home to what was a brutal Marxist military dictatorship, and no place where an unskilled 15-year-old was going to be able to do much good, but somewhere where they could come to a great deal of harm. So yes, I think all those things were mixed together. But the one thing about it, and I think it has actually helped me through my life, is I think when you are dealing with issues like that, you can either focus inward, and what I tried to do was focus outward. That some of my anger and confusion, I directed that anger to the government and to people who just weren't doing the right thing, and I think that probably helped me, really.
And there's that one moment where you're really you're in complete sort of despair at that moment where you were contemplating suicide, and there's a couple of points in the book where you do mention how if something hadn't happened, it could have triggered, life could have turned out very differently. And there were people there to help you and support you, weren't there?
That's right. I was extremely fortunate in my life. I have been. I mean, I had the most amazingly forgiving and tolerant parents, for starters, I should say. But at the point when I realized I'd gone around all the aid agencies kind of offering my help, and I just got kind of bewildered responses from them about what was this boy with no skills at all doing in Ethiopia. And I kind of realized I had nowhere to go. And being 15, instead of thinking all my parents will want is me back safe and sound, I thought, well, I can never go back home. I've stolen from my parents. I've run away from home. There's no way out. And I felt, on top of everything else, it was just such a sense of failure. So it was a really dangerous moment for me. And luckily, at that crucial time, my parents, my father was a clergyman, well, is a retired clergyman, and he had got in touch via the sort of church network with an Anglican clergyman. The Anglican Church ran a mission in Addis, and they worked together with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church running orphanages for children who were displaced either by the war, the civil war that was going on, or by the famine. And my dad got hold of him. He was a guy called Father Charles Sherlock, really remarkable man. He was in his 30s, which I think helped. So I think he was closer. I mean, he was double my age or more, but he was at least close to it. And he had first gone to Ethiopia when he was 17. So he had a sort of slight, understanding, I think, of the idealism that I had felt. Anyway, he arrived just at the absolutely critical moment. He managed to find out where I was, and he kind of banged on the door, and he really, through his wisdom and his kindness, he really saved my life, to be honest. And the one thing he really said to me was, I can't tell you what to do or what not to do. Your life is your own, but I can tell you how much you are loved. I can tell you how much, if anything happened to you, that loss would be felt. And I do want you to understand that you are far more precious than right now you're willing to believe. And that was an amazing moment for me. And really, I think with his wisdom and his kindness, as I say, he saved my life.
And one of what we should remind people about is that at that time in the 80s, you were still at school, and the government had brought in this law, Clause 28, that basically stopped schools from being able to counsel, advise, support young, LGBT, people. And that was a real. It's quite difficult to think of that now. And I know the college, for instance, Petrock has got an LGBT group that meets regularly. I know a lot of the schools around the area have LGBT groups as well. It's a very different situation to what it was back then.
Yeah, I think it's hard now, given the things that have happened subsequently, to really put oneself back in that situation. And in fact, the recent TV series, it's a sin, which really powerfully evoked some of those issues again. But you're right, there was a huge hysteria about AIDS, and particularly about gay people. There was a whole drum roll of anti-gay sentiment, which led to, as you mentioned, the government literally legislating against gay people. And I would say that was kind of my 18th birthday present from the Conservative government. I'm not, in one sense, it didn't change what happened at my school, because it actually was passed just about the time I was leaving, or even afterwards. But it was the whole spirit of the time. And it was, the tabloids were hunting out people with AIDS. They were exposing them. They were vilifying them. And it was really a terrifying time, not to mention, this disease which was ravaging communities.
No, it's interesting. I'm glad that you've mentioned it's a sin, because I think that has really brought that time starkly back, and it's how it was. I have to say, I'm not usually the sort of person who sits and cries when I watch a TV program, but I did at that. It brought back, as a friend of mine said to me, wow, open doors that had long been closed. I'm a little bit older than you, so when I first moved to London, sort of after leaving university, mid-80s, in my first apartment, all three of my flatmates, within a year of me, we were in a flat together. The following year, they're all dead. And my second, the apartment that I shared with, two were dead. Another one was ill. That's how it sort of. It's hard to sort of imagine now what was sort of going on through us for being, gay people, but also the contrast now. I mean, what do you, because we've been living through a pandemic for the past year. Thank heavens that things are now sort of getting under control for that. But for a long time, through that pandemic that was with us in the 80s, it was almost a sort of a, well, it's happening to that group over there. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah. I think there's a great distinction between these two pandemics, because the AIDS pandemic was this is your fault. It was the opposite of we're all in this together. It was, it was highly focused, highly prejudiced against gay people. I mean, you will remember, there were newspaper headlines calling on gay people to be herded onto the Isle of Wight, and kind of in turn there was, and I think it is hard to really, go back and think. And certainly as a teenager myself, the feelings both of terror at this disease which was ravaging communities, and the kind of fear of the spirit that was being engendered in the country. But there is a good news part of this, which is that I think where we are now demonstrates how things can change, how they can change for the better, and how they can change in a remarkably rapid way. If you'd said to anybody in 1988, as the Local Government Act, which you referred to, Section 28 of, was being passed, that, just a couple of decades later, that we would be or slightly over that, 25 years later, we would be passing an Act of Parliament to allow equal marriage for same-sex couples. I mean, that's extraordinary. I reflect in the book how in 1988, April 1988, when I crossed the border back out of apartheid South Africa into Zimbabwe, that if anybody had told you that in 2 years' time, at that point, that Nelson Mandela would be released, that the liberation movements would be unbanned, and that a few years later there would be a democratic, multiracial South Africa, you would have been committed to a mental institution. That was utterly crazy. So I suppose my message is that from all the difficult situations, the thing to hang on to is things can and do change. But they don't change on their own. They change by people getting out there and doing something about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, as part of our diversity festival last summer, we interviewed Michael, Lord Cashman, one of the founders of Stonewall, and it just sort of, he was talking then about, that whole sort of history and the period. And you're right, I suppose that's a message for anyone, that things do change. Exactly as you were saying that, I mean, I spent a year studying in East Germany, 1983-84, and while I was there, if you'd have told me 5 years later it would all be gone, I'd have laughed at you. I mean, I would have just said, no, this doesn't happen. But as you say, people slowly had been working away behind the scenes. Then more people came on, more people realized this was what they wanted to do. And the driving force of the majority of the people just stopped, changed that society. And it's the same with South Africa, isn't it? So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was actually studying politics at university at the time that the Berlin Wall came down, and part of my course was comparative politics with the Soviet bloc countries. And we had to toss all the textbooks out the window because these amazing things were happening. And I in fact ended up in Prague in 1989 during the Velvet Revolution, which was an amazing experience for me. But as you say, just a year or so, it was a fixed fact of life. There was that Iron Curtain in Europe. There was always going to be an East Germany and the Berlin Wall, and it was sort of inconceivable it would change, and then, hey, it did.
Yeah, we had to sort of accommodate it, and I suppose we've been shown that as well in the last month with the change of government in America. That literally from one moment to the next, there's a change.
That's right. Although I think there's still a lot of
Yeah.
There are a lot of issues to work through in the States. As of course there are both in Eastern Europe and in South Africa, and indeed, you know, in our own society, you know, we've come a hell of a long way on a lot of issues, but there's still, you know, there were still lots of challenges to be met.
I'm just going to go back to, because in the book, something I hadn't been aware of was your connection with Africa. And, you know, we started out that you took that trip with your dad's credit card to Ethiopia. And that was that was the bit that stuck in my mind. But then reading the book, there was you know, when you were a teacher in Zimbabwe, you know, then, you know, your work with the South African, in South African politics. And that, I suppose, is just something really relevant to the college, because you know, schemes like the Erasmus scheme that has enabled students to go over to other places, you know, sample a different culture. I know that it was Africa with yourself, but to me, I mean, I don't know if you feel about it, but I think that should be such an important part of any young person's life education.
I couldn't agree more, and certainly for me it was such a privilege, those experiences in completely different contexts from what I was used to, but from which I learned a huge amount. And really, when I left Ethiopia after about a month or so, Charles Sherlock had said to me, the clergyman who'd rescued me, he said, you know, you need to go back home, get yourself some skills, you know, you can't really contribute here. But when you have, remember that many of the challenges that exist in Africa will remain, and the TV cameras, you know, do not maintain their interest for very long. And I always took that to heart. So in 1988, I had a chance to go and teach in a rural school in Zimbabwe. And I leapt at it. I mean, Zimbabwe is a completely different country from Ethiopia, different sort of end of a vast continent. But I loved my time there. I learned a huge amount. I formed some really, you know, long-lasting friendships, and I'm hugely privileged to still be in touch with a lot of the kids. Well, I mean, they're now in their 40s, so they're not kids, but the students who I taught at the time. And the thing I think it did most is to give me, you know, a perspective that, you know, life isn't just lived from one point of view, you know, here in London or even in Devon, you know. People have lots of different experiences, and having the chance to share and take part in those was an immense privilege.
Yeah, no, I should have said at the start that I'm a governor of Petrock College, and that's one of the things I've been most proud of in the time that I've been a governor. The college, in seeing how those trips to overseas, I'm just trying to, you know, it's transformed some of those young people's lives. They'll never forget those experiences, and the pride of their parents, you know, as they're hearing, you know, what their children have been up to and what they did and what they've learned. And I've seen them actually come back with, there was a group that went out there a couple of years ago learning about, I think it was in Sweden they went to, and they learned some sort of new sort of techniques for lessons for primary school children. They came back and sort of showed us and put on a display on how they would do this, taking children into, you know, out into the countryside and learn, you bringing those sort of elements into the classroom. Just it was this joy that they'd actually it unlocked something, and I felt that when I read the book that was something that it had done that for you as well.
Absolutely, it did, and I would urge anybody who has the chance to go abroad and you know, learn from other cultures and other experiences. You know, jump at it. It's fantastic, and it will only enrich your life.
No, good. And then moving on to the area which we know one another through now is your sort of political life. What was that like, actually being a part of that government that was able to enact some of the things that you had been sort of standing for all your life?
Well, it was great. I mean, the moment when the minister for development, for international development, announced that we had reached the 0.7% target. This is the United Nations target for the proportion of wealth that wealthy countries should spend on international development aid. You know, it was really special to me, because I had, you know, one of the reasons that I joined, well, actually, it was the Liberal Party at the time, but then the Liberal Democrats, was because they had had a commitment from the 1970s to this issue of properly playing our part in providing international development aid, and they you know, talked about it and campaigned on it, and that had inspired me, and we achieved that in the government. And obviously, you know, issues around sexuality had you know, been a huge part of my life. So being there when we passed the Equal Marriage Act was, you know, really an amazing thing, and also less well known when Norman, who was our Norman Lamb, who was our Minister of Health, Minister of State at the Department of Health, and he established the first waiting time targets in the NHS for mental health studies. He pushed for more investment in services. There's a huge way to go, but and we're seeing the demand now more than ever, and you know, the services that still are not up to what's needed by any means. But the fact that he and Nick Clegg were really putting that front and centre of their political messages, and indeed put it on the front page of their manifesto in the 2015 election, was important to me as well. So you know, there's many things people will criticise the coalition for, some of them with good reason, but there's also some achievements of which I'm very proud.
Mm-hmm. And did you ever find being gay sort of held you back in any way? I mean, where I'm coming from is because, you know, I was at a meeting not long ago. If somebody had said, "Oh well," they wanted, you know, people to understand some of the sort of difficulties that, you know, people, you know, gone through for their sexuality, and they sort of said, "Oh yeah, but David, you know, we want to hear from somebody who really had to struggle through it." And I was sort of like, "You don't know what I had to go through at times through life and in career." Did you find any sort of, suppose I'll ask you, did you find any of that at all in your career and life? Or?
Well, yes. I mean, I think a lot of the holding back and the things that may have held me back at times were sort of in a way internal, but they were internal reactions to, you know, what was going on. I mean, it was, you know, it was incredibly rare for there to be out politicians, even in the early 1990s. And so that was the whole sort of environment. Being gay was, you know, that was not, that was not thought to be a way you could have a successful political career. So, you know, coming out was, you know, quite a thing to do. I mean, luckily, the kind of hostility that had existed in the 1980s still, you know, started to dissipate in the 90s. But, you know, still sort of late in that time, you know, the Daily Mail or the Sun, I can't remember which it was having headlines about the gay mafia in Labour. You know, I mean, I suppose that the fact that they were talking about that suggested that gay people were maybe making some progress. But so what I'd say was I was a member of a Liberal Party, which had been the first party that had a statement on gay rights back in the 70s and had pioneered that thing. So obviously within that, I didn't feel myself direct discrimination from anybody, but I did feel that for a long time that being gay was not an acceptable thing in politics, full stop.
Yeah, and there's often this sort of, that word that people use a lot now, unconscious bias, where even in an environment where people are supportive at the same time, it can be acting against you. And I think that's something which, you know, it's right the way it's becoming aware of your sort of bias towards certain situations and people. I mean, I remember I worked for the Economist for a long time, and you know, I always remember one of my colleagues saying to me, "Oh, don't tell people you're gay because they won't take you seriously." Because there was this sort of image that, oh, you're gay, all you want to do is, you know, have a good time and have a party life. And so it was really because, you know, we're human beings, the same as everyone else. But that was in an organisation like The Economist that was sort of there. But you had to be.
No, I remember similar experiences of people who were personally very, you know, supportive in one sense, you know, but who'd say, but, you know, don't feel you have to tell everybody about it because that could be difficult for you, you know, which is actually not ultimately very supportive. But you know, generally, I you know, you just have to sort of push through that sort of stuff. I think it would have been much more difficult if, you know, if I'd been starting out in politics in the 1980s. You know, we know what happened to people like Peter Tatchell and, you know, who were absolutely savagely vilified and, you know, and even people like sort of Michael Cashman, not in so much in the political sphere, but, you know, in the TV sphere, you know, and he got, you know, lots of nasty kind of stuff and abuse, and so it was a difficult time. I was lucky that we were coming out of that difficult time, although it was still quite challenging.
Yeah, I suppose it's just for all organisations and for us all to be that's something that we've got to be aware of, because it's there, and how we can sort of overcome that sort of those difficulties. I'm just going to see if there are any. I think there might have been some questions asked in the chat. There was one that was asked earlier regarding the environment, and I think it was along the lines of, you know, what, because I know obviously in the House of Lords you are the spokesperson on the Lib Dem spokesperson on the environment and climate emergency. What single thing do you think that we could do to actually each of us individually to improve the environment?
Well, the first thing I'd say is get involved. Don't stand on the sidelines. We are facing a climate emergency, as has been said by many people. This is you know, too often glossed over by the media, but we are heading at the moment for 3 to 4 degrees of warming by the end of this century. That would be absolutely cataclysmic for human life. And, you know, it is a very good thing that the government has set ambitious targets for net zero by 2050, for 68% reduction in our emissions by 2030, but they're just targets. You know, we have to do things. We have to start taking action, and the government needs to start taking some of those difficult decisions. Now, for them to do that, they need to have pressure on them. They need to hear from the public and understand that the public are with them, and not be able to use the excuse the public won't go along with things. So I'd say get involved. I mean, obviously there are things that you can do in you know, in London. Some of them are much easier. You know, using public transport rather than getting in a car. In rural areas, that's much harder. You know, moving to electric vehicles, but that's expensive and not practical for some people. And, you know, insulating your home, doing things like that to reduce emissions. And we should obviously all play our part in doing whatever we can in those regards. But I think one of the things that COVID has demonstrated to us is that individual choices will not get us anywhere near what we need. So even with all our you know, travel, almost all air travel in terms of, you know, holidays and stuff being closed down, even in terms of total lockdowns at the beginning and people not moving around, you know, we did see a decrease in emissions, but nothing like the scale of what we need. So what's clear to me about that is, yes, we should encourage people to take individual actions and think about how much they fly or think about these things all the time. But we have to understand that we're going to solve this issue. It's about systemic change. And that means that we all need to get behind government, get them doing the stuff that needs to be done to achieve the targets that we've set. Because if we don't, the consequences are unthinkable.
Yeah, I think it's the environment, because it's where we live here in Northern Devon. I mean, it's sort of there on it's really part of our lives. I mean, I'm just thinking, I live just right by the sea, and when we have the storms here just this last week, we've got a Westward Ho Beach. The pebbles were great big, not got to call them pebbles, great big rocks being moved and shifted. It's just a constant sort of fight. We get it every time. The storms are getting stronger and stronger. You see it each year, and it is it's there. It's a real threat to our our where we live and the sort of the environment. So it is, yeah.
And I think we should be aware that that there was huge disruption that's been caused to lots of people already in the UK through flooding and through more extreme weather events. That's happening now. I mean, we're lucky enough at the moment to have the wealth to deal with some of these things, but they're going to get more extreme and more difficult to deal with. But particularly in areas, when I talk to people in Zimbabwe, these extreme weather events and the greater frequency of droughts, of cyclones, deteriorating soil conditions, drying up water courses, these are matters of life and death. So I guess the message is that climate change isn't something that might happen with disastrous consequences in the future if we don't do something. It is happening now with disastrous consequences to people. But again, the good news is we can do stuff. Human ingenuity is such that we can, if we act now, transform things. But we have to act now. Time really, really is running out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the last couple of years, my own council, where I'm the mayor, we declared a climate emergency, and I remember sort of thinking, what does that mean? Actually, though, we're on a sort of a learning curve, because you really begin to realise, like we were saying, there are things you can do. So it's only a time, but there are, and it's incremental, and it starts to sort of set a different way of just taking into account and changing certain things that we do. The college, Petrock, is going to be one of the very first in the country, if not the first in the country, to have an e-bike rental scheme set up. So that it's really it's part of their DNA, let's say, of the college. I think it's really sort of up there. So I know that students, staff, the senior management, have got this very much on their sort of side. Yeah.
Well, I think that's great, and it's, initiatives like that and things like that happening all around the country are really important. And I think a sense that people can contribute is really important, and they can. There's no doubt. But I would reiterate. I mean, I think getting the understanding out there about what you're doing at the college, about why you're doing it, and ensuring that politicians, and by that I don't mean just national politicians, I mean local politicians, I mean local media, understand that this is an issue that people care about, because until, it is picking up now, but the coverage of what is going on has been pretty woeful. I remember about a year, maybe 18 months ago, seeing a piece in the Times, and it was, I think, on the third page, and it was reporting on the International Panel on Climate Change, the UN panel, the scientific panel that looks at these things, which was basically saying at the moment, we are on track for a climate disaster, absolute cataclysmic impact on human life. And it was on page 3 on the Times. And I thought, either you dismiss it and say, well, we don't believe it and it's not true. If you are publishing it and saying you think it's true. That should be on the front page, not just today, every day. And it isn't. But these things have come much more to the fore, partly because of a lot of activism, you know, and we saw the Extinction Rebellion activity. Now, there's aspects of that I think were counterproductive, but we should also be clear, they got stuff on the map. They got it in the media when the media was ignoring it. And so, you know, ensuring that people understand how important this issue is to people generally, particularly to young people who I'm afraid are going to have to deal with a lot of the consequences of the bad policy choices that have been made over the last few decades and more. But the more that people get out there and have a voice, the more we can galvanize for real change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of David Attenborough. I mean, his sort of messages in those TV programs that he puts across, I think he's probably done more to raise awareness in some ways. It's how to reach people, isn't it? It's getting that message across to them and making them realise. And I just go back to, because we're surrounded by such beautiful, I mean, this is, you know, it's a beautiful area here, Northern Devon, and we are that little bit remote and cut off, and you know, that we feel it more. It's part of our daily lives. Everywhere we go, you want to go for a walk, you walk, you know, the countryside is there, the sea is there. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a much greater understanding that's been developed about the impact that we are having on nature around the world, the destruction of ecology, and the feed-in that has to climate issues. And I think you're right. I mean, I think what David Attenborough's done as the sort of, you know, almost the father of the nation, the trusted voice, it is amazing and really important, and it should go on. But I think that COVID has also brought quite a lot of people more in contact with nature. You know, the number of people you see out walking now. I discovered patches of a chalk stream river near me, and the wildlife and habitat there that I'd never been aware of really properly, even though, you know, they were not that far from my home. And I think that hopefully out of this crisis, we will treasure that nature resource that we have a little bit more.
Yeah, no, my town here, Westward Ho, we've got a very famous, it's a big surfing country here. I mean, if you know the area, but there's a lot of surfing beaches, and a lot of people come along and buy this throwaway polystyrene boards that basically they're very cheap. They buy them because they think, oh, well, I'm only going to be down there for a few days on holiday, but they literally break up. And the number of them that we've had on our beaches down here is just, you know, it's running into the hundreds. They went down on one of the beaches at Croyd and just did a sort of a collection, and it was just you wouldn't believe how many that are being washed up on our beaches. And the village here, Westward Ho, is the first. They've had a campaign to try and persuade businesses not to sell them. And Westward Ho is the first village in the country to actually have declared that they are not going to sell them at all. And but they've now got a petition going that's going to come to Parliament. But it's these little initiatives from this little area here that are actually becoming, you know, could become national.
Well, I think I mean that's great to hear, and it shows what a difference local activism can make, you know, and that sort of goes back, I think, to my wider point is the one thing I learned in Ethiopia is you know, you don't change the world in a big bang and on your own. That doesn't happen. It happens by lots of people, you know, getting together and campaigning on issues that they care about. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it's rapid. Sometimes it starts with a small thing. And you know, in Montgomery, Alabama, it was the refusal of Rosa Parks to stand up on a bus for a white person, and that really kicked off a civil rights movement that changed a lot of things in America. Small acts, when they become underpinned by lots of other people, making their own small sacrifices makes a huge difference. So, you know, you've given one example of it there in Westwood Ho, but it's happening all over the country, and all power to everybody who cares enough about their communities to get involved and to seek change.
Yeah, I don't know what sort of situation is, whether we're allowed to at the moment or when we will be allowed to, but I know that they want to actually come up to Parliament to sort of bring their petition and stuff. So hopefully, would you be able to meet with them when they come up?
Well, I would absolutely meet with them if we're allowed to, as soon as we're allowed to, but I would be delighted to, because I think, you know, that's such a strong signal of how you get things done.
No, thank you. I've got another question coming in here. It goes back to your youth. It says, what advice would Jonny give to a young person navigating their sexuality, and what advice would he have given his younger self?
The first bit of advice I'd give is don't nick your dad's credit card and run away to another continent. It's a very bad and very dangerous thing to do. It's difficult in one sense to give advice because, you know, contexts are very different. And although I've talked a lot about the you know, the difficult pressures, and we both talked about them, of the 1980s for somebody struggling with sexuality, and that's thank God moved on in many ways. You know, many of the pressures that exist now on people who are 14, 15 didn't exist in our time. You know, the whole social media aspect of bullying and vilification and all of that sort of things. I mean, I don't know how I would have coped with. So I don't in any way subscribe to the view, oh, you know, they've all got it easy now, we had it tough, because people are dealing with different challenges. The one thing that I would say, and it's really to repeat to everybody, that what Father Charles Sherlock said to me is that, you know, try and remember, even at your darkest times, that you are, you know, a very precious person, and you are far more precious than you're probably willing to believe. I think it's probably easier to talk about sexuality now than it was, but and that's helpful, obviously, that people can express themselves. But I do remember that when I came out, I kind of expected, you know, the whole weight to lift completely off my shoulders, because I'd told everybody, and that was great, and people were almost without exception, you know, very supportive of me. But what I realized afterwards was that I'd spent so much time worrying about what other people might think about my sexuality that I hadn't really dealt with my own kind of internalized prejudices, I suppose, you know, that I didn't want to be gay because of all that had been sort of pumped into me over those years in the 80s. So I think be kind to yourself and give yourself time to explore how you feel about things. But do, whenever you can, you know, speak to your friends. And if you have friends and you know they're struggling, or you think they are, you know, often it's like, oh, I don't know how to deal with this. What should I do? Just reach out. There isn't a perfect way to deal with everything. I talk in my book about a time in my 20s when I was in a really bad way, and a very close friend of mine had, you know, we were chatting. He could see I wasn't in a good way, but didn't want to talk about it. And, you know, we're just giving those like, I'm fine kind of answers. But he left a card in my briefcase, which just said, you know, please lift your head up and be happy. You know, I love you very much. And I remember opening that, and just that sense that somebody really cared, understood that I probably wasn't in a great way to receive it in terms of a conversation at the time. That really mattered. So, you know, do whatever you can. And then the final point I'd make, and this is particularly for parents, I've had a number of people say to me when they've interviewed me, your parents seem like they were really kind of thoughtful people, and so how was it that you came in the state? And the message I give to parents is, it is not your fault if your adolescent son or older or daughter is struggling. People struggle. It's not your fault. Just be there for them as much as you can. If my parents were amazing for me, really, although they had to deal with an extremely difficult teenager for a long time. But don't take it on yourself that somehow this is your failure. It's a tough time being a teenager, being an adolescent, dealing with those things. It just is.
Yeah, no, that is actually really excellent advice, because I know I've got a friend of mine at the moment whose daughter is struggling with her identity, and it's a really difficult time for the parents. I was looking around and thinking, are there sort of support groups for the parents? Because actually, exactly to say what you were saying there, that it's okay, it's not your fault, there's no sort of game plan here. It's not that you've done something wrong here, and you probably, whatever you're going to do, your child in some way is going to say you're not doing the right thing. It's a really hard time, and it is. I remember when I was in China for Shanghai Pride, and one of the big events I remember of that was that they had this event for parents came along, and it was thousands of parents, and it was them sharing the experience and just being able to sort of almost exactly what you're saying there, just give them a little bit of support. I think that's really, really important for them to know, and it's certainly in the context of a college, that actually there's another dimension there that perhaps we're not connecting with the parents. It's always, there isn't a blueprint for them to follow. No, very good point. Thank you.
I think generally I'd just say, David, that in all circumstances, I found this when my mother died. You can notice there are people, and actually it was interesting, the colleagues I worked with in Kenya at the time, they were immediately in touch with me and saying, I'm so sorry, and wanting to talk about it, and your mum, and some of my colleagues in London were fantastic and incredibly supportive and all that, but I could tell quite a few of them were quite wary, well, he probably won't want to talk about it or whatever, and I would have been the same as well. But actually, what people do want generally, and they'll tell you if they don't, but is to talk about things, is just the signal that other people, really care. And so if you can give them that in whatever circumstance it is, do it, take the risk that somebody might be like, oh, I really don't want to talk about it. That's much better than them thinking, why doesn't that person care enough to say something? Always say something.
And you touched on, was a big part of your book. I mean, your what politically, the same-sex marriage that came through, but your relationship with David, that's obviously been an underpinning of and it's helped you. How much has that sort of enabled you to be where you are today?
I think it's massive. I'm so lucky in meeting my partner David, who I could wax lyrical for hours on what a wonderful person he is. I'll spare people what a wonderful person he is, but I'll spare people that. But finding that person, I say in the book, it was like kind of bingo. I can't believe that I've actually found this person who I really feel is a soulmate, and it does help you get through things. No doubt about it. Having somebody who just instinctively understands you, who can tell you, when to snap out of things, but knows, when that's not going to be the solution. Just somebody who you basically knows in your corner all the time. I think that's that's wonderful, and I'm incredibly lucky to have it.
Yeah, and going back to when we were younger, that gay relationships weren't sort of deemed as being sort of long term, were they? But so the symbolism of marriage, that recognition of loving long term relationship was so important.
Well, I think it's actually one of the things that's born out of the TV series we were talking about earlier. It's a sin, because there was always an argument from the sort of the church, the anti-gay part of the church, the anti-gay lobby, which was, oh, these people, they're very promiscuous, they don't form relationships, blah blah blah. At the same time, as the church and others saying you can't have a relationship, it's a anybody who, the section 28 talked about a pretended family relationship in terms of gay couples. I mean, it's astonishing. So, and I think that they really draw that out in It's a Sin, and I think it's in the last episode where one of the people is talking to the mother and say, well, you made this person ashamed of what they were. How could they form a relationship? Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that has moved on. And the one thing, I was so happy to be part of the coalition when we changed things. I mean, it started with civil partnerships and under Tony Blair's government, which was a massive change for the better, and certainly changed my life, because David and I wouldn't be together if it wasn't for that, because he was an American citizen, so he probably wouldn't have had the right to stay. And I think Lynn Featherstone, who was our minister in the Home Office, who came and said to Nick, this is what we need to push for. We need to push for this legislation. And to be fair to David Cameron, he agreed to that, and he then expended quite a lot of political capital with his party, because the majority of them did not vote with it. It was only because of Labour votes and Lib Dems that we got it through. But he did say one thing which I thought was interesting. He said, I don't believe in gay marriage despite being a Conservative. I believe in it because I'm a Conservative. And I think there's a sort of interesting issue there. But yes, that has made a real difference. It makes you feel you're part of a society that recognises you, values your relationships. And I think that, whereas if you're in a society that doesn't value your relationships, it tells you that they're wrong and bad, it's not surprising that those relationships are under pretty much a large degree of pressure. Yeah,
and I suppose that when we were talking about same-sex marriage and bringing that in, that we weren't, its impact, the way it has impacted in the way we've just been discussing, that wasn't actually perhaps thought of as why we were doing it, but it actually has. It's really sort of it's really normalized, made us part. I think brought us more into sort of society, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, I remember a gay man who worked for Nick Clegg at the time when the Equal Marriage Act, the Same-Sex Marriage Act, was passed, and he told Nick about walking past. I think it was an outlet of Moss Bros, and they had a sort of his kind of wedding thing together.
Yeah.
And he said how it just made him feel he walked a little taller. It made him feel more accepted. It made him feel that his life was more valued. And so I think you're right. I think beyond the practicalities, which to some extent, civil partnership granted, most of those rights anyway, I think it was quite an important symbolic matter to say that, gay people, lesbian people have equal civil rights.
Yeah, I should have, at the beginning, I should have told people that you were the chief of staff for Nick Clegg when he was Deputy Prime Minister. So that was, you were there at the centre of government for those years of the coalition. Was anything, we've talked about this, but was there anything on that you'd like to sort of reflect on, what it felt like being at the centre of power?
Well, it felt a huge amount of pressure. It was also a kind of privilege to be able to try and do some of the things that we've talked about, whether that was on overseas aid, whether it was on education in terms of protecting education funding, establishing a pupil premium, whether it was about equal marriage or mental health issues. That was a great privilege and opportunity. It was also huge pressure. I mean, we weren't in government on our own. We were a small part of a government which was dominated by Conservatives. And I, make no secrets of the fact in the book, my politics has been kind of inspired by an opposition to that Thatcherite government in the 1980s. All my politics been in southwest London while I've been in the UK, which has been, battling against Conservatives. And to some extent, it was my worst nightmare to find ourselves in government with them. But, we found ourselves at a time where, the Labour Party was not ready to govern with us. The numbers didn't exist really anyway. It would have required everybody in the Labour Party absolutely to support it. Even then, we would have had to have all the nationalists, all the unionists, all, everybody backing us. But Labour weren't up for it. So we had a choice. Did we just sit on the sidelines, or did we try and do something worthwhile in government? I think we made some very serious errors, and I reflect on some of them in the book. I mean, tuition fees is obviously a real clear one, and I think the damage that did, not just in terms of the actual issue, but in terms of trust, was a serious one, and it was a real mistake for which we paid a heavy price. But I think we did do a number of very important things to ensure that those least well off were protected, who wouldn't have been. If I explain in the book at one point when it came to uprating of benefits and inflation. It's hard to remember now, but at the beginning of the coalition was about 5.6%. And George Osborne said, no, we're going to scrap this uprating. And Nick Clegg said, absolutely not. We are not going to do that, because these are the people with the least who will be disproportionately impacted by inflation. George Osborne was completely bewildered. He said to Nick, well, Nick, none of these people are ever going to vote for you. You do realise that, don't you? And Nick said to him, well, I think we have rather broader responsibilities than just the people who vote for us. Now, George found that absolutely astonishing statement. He was genuinely bewildered by it. And in one sense, I suppose he was right. None of those people ever probably knew that Nick did that, and certainly never thanked him for. Doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do. Because lots of people's, would have been really harshly affected if he hadn't done that. So yeah, there's lots to reflect on, lots to learn on, but overall, it was a privilege.
No, just with the big issue at the moment, Black Lives Matter. There's, some of I interviewed, I don't know if you know him, Jason Jones, the LGBT activist from Trinidad, and who brought about the change of decriminalisation of homosexuality in Trinidad through his own his own private legal challenge to the situation there. And I interviewed him last year for the Diversity Festival, and he was talking about the real problems for sort of LGBT people from ethnic minorities, not just in the States, but here in the UK. That to me, yes, I think there is because I was thinking, we've made such strides, we've done such great, you were part of a government that made those changes, society is changing, but there is that issue that is still here, that there is still prejudice amongst us and towards some of the Black LGBT community individuals. What do you think are the issues that we still need to sort of confront? Would you agree with that? And how, are there any sort of things that you think we might be able to do that?
Yeah, I think there are issues we need to confront. I think some of the prejudices within communities against gay people is often driven from their cultural origins. So, you know, for example, in Zimbabwe, the government has ruthlessly used homophobia to attack people and, you know, brutalize people. And you know, they've been spreading poisonous propaganda about gay people for decades now, and it's not surprising that that has some impact, and that will have impact, you know, on communities in the UK, you know, Zimbabwe communities as well, and that's true pretty much across the board because, you know, of Britain's colonial laws. And they most of the laws under which people are prosecuted around the world are British colonial era laws, and we have a specific and particular responsibility, I think, to campaign on those issues. But I mean, I think at home, you know, the truth is that communities with more conservative approaches, it's much harder to be gay. That's not simply if you're black, but it's true across the board. I think also there's been a lot of racism experienced by gay people within the gay community. And I think that is, I mean, that's a reflection, I'm afraid, of wider society. You know, there's no, you know, being gay does not make you virtuous any more than being straight makes you virtuous. You know, it's a fact about your sexuality, but we have to tackle the issues of racism, prejudice in all communities, and I think it is a particular one that you know, gay people who have been discriminated against and have seen prejudice should really you know, feel as an absolute priority to take on.
No, it's absolutely goes right to the DNA of Sunrise Diversity. You know, I'm the chair and is hosting this, you know, the event today, because we really do sort of, you know, say, you know, you have to embrace diversity in all its forms. You know, we won't accept any form of discrimination on one level, you know, because it's there, but it's actually very challenging, because you do find some individuals who are perhaps more conservative towards LGBT issues. You also find, you know, there are LGBT people who can have racist views, and it's like, I'm sorry, neither of those we won't. But it's how you sort of tackle them and deal with them. No, but that's I think it's going to be one of the sort of challenges going forward, because, you know, you're right there. I think there is prejudice in our own community, and it is that legacy of us. When we're talking about the empire, people talk about the British Empire, obviously its impact on race, but what I don't think people are aware about, we're becoming more, that you're right, those laws that criminalize homosexuality, they came from us. You know, it's our sort of colonial legacy that we left there, and we brought many of those sort of aspects in that we have a sort of responsibility in some ways to try to help those countries.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true, and I mean it goes beyond you know, the laws against gay people. I mean, most of the repressive legislation to persecute political opponents in Zimbabwe was not passed by, you know, the government of Zimbabwe. It was passed by the government of Rhodesia. It is colonial era oppression, and it's now tragically being used against you know, by citizens by their own government, as opposed to a sort of white minority government. But it's a terrible legacy that we've left.
Yeah, no. Well, I'm aware that we've been talking now for way over an hour, and it's been really fascinating. talking with you. Is there anything else that you would like to sort of add to what any other aspects, anything you'd like to sort of add to what we've been talking about?
I think we've probably covered most things, and as you know, politicians can talk forever, so we better be careful. I think I would just reiterate in another way the point I made earlier, which is that you can change the world. Everybody can have their part in changing the world. They won't do it on their own, but they will do it standing with other people, campaigning, whether it's a local level, national level, whatever the issue is. You can change the world, and you can change the world for individuals as well. That's the important thing to recall as well. And I remember when I became a councillor, and I sort of thought of it as the beginning of a big grandstanding sort of political career in the council. But what I found most rewarding was actually the casework that I did, was breaking through bureaucratic hurdles, where, as I say, you found you could change the world for a person, for their lives. And I think that's really important to remember. There are big issues. There are also small issues. There are also personal issues, which in those people's lives mean the world to them. So try and do both.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Well, Jonny, thank you very much for giving us your time this morning, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to invite you down to Northern Devon in person. I think it would be really good. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to everybody who's listened. Very grateful.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.